About 3,800 years ago, long before shaped harbors or carved docks defined waterways, human groups lived close to wide rivers, marshlands, and calm lake edges where reeds grew thick and tall, bending gently with the wind and reflecting soft light across shallow water. And each day began as early mist hovered low over the surface, blurring the line between land and water, while simple huts made from woven reeds, branches, and packed earth rested slightly above the damp ground, protected from flooding by raised banks formed through repeated use. And as morning light spread slowly, movement resumed with quiet purpose as bundles of dried reeds were gathered from storage areas and carried toward open ground near the shore, their pale surfaces catching the glow of the rising sun, while waterbirds stirred nearby and insects skimmed the surface of the river. Along the water's edge, hands moved carefully through thick reed beds, selecting stalks by length and flexibility, cutting them low near the base and stacking them neatly in long piles where they could dry evenly. The process unhurried and methodical, repeated again and again as familiarity guided selection rather than haste. And nearby, others cleared muddy patches of ground, smoothing the surface with flat stones and packed earth to create firm working areas where construction could continue without sinking or disruption. The scent of wet soil and river plants thick in the air as the day warmed. As the reeds dried under sunlight, attention shifted toward preparation. Long fibers stripped patiently from plant stems and twisted into cordage through repeated rolling and tightening, soaked briefly in water to increase strength before being stretched and tested, while others arranged thick reed bundles side by side, aligning them carefully so the natural curve of each stalk contributed to the overall shape. Wide at the center and tapering gently toward both ends, the foundation of a vessel emerging slowly without sharp angles or sudden changes, designed to sit lightly on the water rather than cut through it. Throughout this process, daily survival continued alongside construction, with some moving into shallow water using woven traps to guide fish toward calmer edges where they could be collected easily, water rippling gently as movement remained controlled and steady, while others gathered roots and edible plants from the marshy ground, rinsing them in clear shallows before adding them to baskets already filling steadily, reinforcing the balance between building and sustaining life rather than separating the two. As the reed hull took shape, bundles were bound tightly using prepared fibers, each knot pulled firm but not forced, allowing the structure to flex naturally with movement and water. Bindings added layer by layer until the surface became dense and buoyant, capable of repelling moisture while remaining light enough to lift and adjust. And during pauses between tying and alignment, hands pressed gently along the surface, checking firmness and balance by feel alone, making small corrections where unevenness appeared. The process guided by touch and repetition rather than measurement. By midday, sunlight reflected strongly off the water's surface and work shifted briefly toward shade beneath reed shelters where tools were refined further, cords tightened again after drying, and smaller reed sections prepared for reinforcement along the sides, while nearby low fires burned steadily, heating water in simple vessels and cooking gathered food, smoke rising in thin columns that drifted away without disturbing the calm surface of the river. And as food was shared quietly, the unfinished boat rested nearby, its pale form lying parallel to the waterline as if already part of the landscape. When the heat softened slightly, work resumed with renewed focus as additional reed layers were added beneath the hull for extra buoyancy, pressed firmly and bound carefully so water could not easily penetrate. And along the edges, raised sides were shaped gradually by adding narrower bundles, building upward just enough to deflect small waves without creating instability, the form growing organically rather than abruptly. And as the afternoon progressed, shallow grooves were pressed into the base using rounded stones to encourage straight movement when afloat, subtle adjustments that reflected long observation of water behavior rather than sudden invention. Nearby, maintenance of earlier boats continued without interruption. Older vessels pulled gently onto shore, inspected for loosened bindings or softened reeds, repairs made patiently by replacing damaged sections and retightening fibers, ensuring longevity rather than disposal. And these acts reinforced continuity, showing that building was not a single moment but an ongoing cycle of care, observation, and renewal, deeply tied to daily movement across the water. As shadows lengthened and light softened, attention turned toward testing the newly formed hull, lifted carefully by several pairs of hands and carried toward the river's edge where the water remained calm, lowered slowly to observe how it settled, the surface rippling outward as the vessel met the river, floating evenly without tilt, confirming balance achieved through steady repetition rather than force. And nearby, others adjusted positioning by shifting small reed bundles until the hull rested naturally, neither dipping nor resisting movement. As evening approached, final bindings were added while the boat remained partially in the water, allowing fibers to tighten naturally as they absorbed moisture. And when satisfied, the vessel was pulled back onto shore to rest overnight, positioned carefully so drying would occur evenly. Fires refreshed nearby as food preparation resumed, and movement slowed naturally as the day's effort settled into quiet completion, the river reflecting deepening colors while reeds whispered softly in the cooling air. When night arrived fully, the settlement gathered closer to warmth, bodies resting after steady labor, while the new boat rested ready beside older vessels, its pale form blending seamlessly into the shoreline, and even in stillness, the water continued its gentle motion, reinforcing the knowledge that these reed vessels were shaped not to conquer the river, but to move with it, a lesson repeated day after day through careful building, steady gathering, and patient observation that allowed life along the water to continue without urgency or excess. As the sun rose higher and the air warmed along the riverbanks, attention shifted from gathering reeds to shaping them into forms that could float and endure. Long stalks laid side by side on cleared ground where damp sand held them steady, hands aligning lengths carefully so thicker bases met evenly while thinner tips tapered outward. Fibers twisted earlier now drawn tight around bundled sections to bind them securely, each knot tested with slow pressure rather than force, the process repeating rhythmically as bundles grew longer and heavier, their curved shapes beginning to resemble the gentle arc needed to cut through water. Nearby, fires kept low and controlled to dry selected reeds just enough to strengthen them without brittleness, smoke drifting lightly across the shoreline while fish traps set earlier were checked and reset, small catches cleaned at the water's edge and placed aside for later cooking, ensuring work continued without interruption as nourishment and construction moved together. Along the shallows, partially bound reed forms were rolled carefully to test balance, edges adjusting where weight leaned unevenly, additional stalks added or removed until the shape settled naturally, floating briefly when pushed into calm water before being drawn back to shore for reinforcement, the river reflecting sky and movement and soft ripples that mirrored the steady pace of labor. While further inland, others continued gathering, cutting fresh reeds where growth was densest, selecting only those with flexibility and length suited for binding, leaving younger shoots untouched so the banks remained alive and productive. The understanding of renewal guided each decision without spoken rule. As the midday light shimmered across the water, work slowed briefly beneath makeshift shade formed from reeds and branches, fibers re-soaked and retwisted, bindings tightened again as they dried, surfaces smoothed by repeated handling, and meals prepared nearby with roots roasted slowly and fish warmed over embers, eaten calmly as the river continued its gentle movement beside the growing boats, the rhythm of eating and building overlapping without pause. When shadows shifted and heat softened, construction resumed with renewed focus, larger reed bundles drawn together to form the main body, ends curved upward and bound thicker to prevent water from soaking inward, cross bindings added at regular intervals to hold shape under movement, each addition followed by careful inspection and adjustment, the boats growing not through haste but through layered effort, tested again in shallow water where they floated longer each time, weight distributed evenly across their length, stability improving with every correction. As the afternoon advanced, attention turned toward finishing details, smaller reeds woven across surfaces to tighten gaps, extra fibers wrapped along stress points, the underside smoothed by hand to reduce drag, and the boats pulled fully into the water at last, guided gently from shore where they settled calmly, rocking only slightly before finding balance, proof that patience and observation had shaped something functional without force. Nearby, tools were gathered and stored, fires refreshed for evening cooking, and the day's remaining tasks blended seamlessly into preparation for rest. Fish cooked slowly while boats remained tethered at the bank, reeds drying along the shoreline for future repairs, the river reflecting warm tones as the sun lowered and wind softened. As evening approached, final checks were made, bindings pressed once more, floating forms nudged gently to confirm steadiness, and paths cleared along the shoreline for easy movement at dawn, the sense of readiness settling quietly as light faded and insects gathered near water, their movement echoing the constant hum of life around the river. With night arriving gradually, fires burned low and steady, boats resting beside the bank like extensions of the land itself, the day's effort visible not as spectacle but as calm presence, and as bodies settled near warmth and the river continued its endless flow, the understanding deepened that these reed vessels were not endings but beginnings, tools that would carry gathering farther, fishing wider, and movement beyond familiar banks, shaped not by urgency but by repetition, balance, and respect for materials drawn directly from the environment. When darkness fully settled and stars reflected faintly on the water's surface, the boats remained still, ready for the next cycle, while reeds rustled softly in the night air, and the river held the memory of every careful binding, every tested curve, every moment of patience that turned simple plants into vessels capable of carrying life forward, ensuring that when morning returned, the work would continue naturally, extending reach, sustaining survival, and